Hi friends, welcome to another Assemble This video. Today we're making a fresh spring card featuring this beautiful stamp set from Unity Stamp Company. I have some tips for using Distress Watercolor Pencils on cardstock, plus this lovely dreamy layout with a little bit of texture. So let's get started and assemble this card. The stamp I'm using is called Savannah Girl from Unity. I have her stamped on some Hammermill cardstock using VersaFine ink. This is Tuxedo Black. You can use either plain VersaFine or VersaFine Clear. Both work really well. And then I'm going to be using a water brush and Distress Watercolor Pencils. A lot of people find watercoloring on cardstock a bit difficult, so if you're new to watercoloring, use watercolor paper instead until you really feel comfortable with that process, or play around and try it on plain cardstock. I like the look of it, and the watercolor pencils actually have a waxy kind of crayon feel to them, so they don't soak directly into the paper as quickly as, say, the Distress inks or regular watercolor. It is a little bit more friendly when using it on regular cardstock paper. Now I'm starting out by coloring her dress. I want it to have a two-tone kind of color to it. I like the idea of it being kind of purple and blue at the same time, almost iridescent but springy, and I don't know, just gave it something a little bit different than just being purple. And what I found with the pencils, it's best to pick it up directly from the pencil itself using my water brush or paintbrush if you want to use a paintbrush and water, and then paint that onto my cardstock. You want to use as little amount of water as possible. You want that waxy kind of pigment to melt and blend. So you do need some water, but you don't want your brush to be overly wet. When I started at the top of her skirt, I wet the paper first and then tried to draw the pencil on top of that water. And it ended up getting the paper a little too wet. And the more I go over that, the higher risk I have of getting it to pill and tear. So I found it better to just grab it from the pencil and then apply it to the paper. I'm also allowing each of these layers to kind of dry in between. So again, I don't get it too wet. The paper is a bit sensitive to that. So again, that's another thing you have to remember. Watercolor paper can handle a lot more water, so you don't risk that tearing of the paper or peeling it. So you just got to do light layers of color a little bit over and over again and let it dry in between if it gets too wet. So I did her top and her skirt. I put down the blue and the purple. I'm using peacock feathers and wilted violet for her dress. And I'm letting that dry in case I want to come back and add a little bit more pigment. For her skin, I'm using tattered rose and a little bit of walnut stain for the shadow. I like that combination for skin. If I put down too much pigment from the pencil, I just wipe that away with my finger. And what's nice is you just need the tiniest bit amount, and then you'll use your brush and water to kind of spread it out. And I love how the first layer kind of creates a barrier, so your next layer will spread and act like more watercolor. Again, like I said, these are kind of waxy, so they act a little bit different than normal watercolor pigment. So I'm doing her skin and her legs, and again, just kind of letting that dry in between using the least amount of water that I can. And if I do need to come back later, it'll dry in between a little bit, and that'll let me kind of layer things up. For her hat ribbon, I use mustard seed, and then for the basket and hat colors, I'm using walnut stain and ground espresso. And I'm using the ground espresso as the darker portion. That'll create the shadow for me. I like to use a tapping motion where I want the color to be darkest, and then I'll use the water in the brush to slightly move that out and soften around the edges. I have a baby wipe to my right. I will use that to clean off between my colors, or if I get too much pigment on my brush, I can clean it off that way. This is what I use instead of dipping my brush into a cup of water each time, which tends to use a lot of water. There's not a lot of pigment on my brush, so it's easy to just wipe it away using a baby wipe. For her hair, I'm using the same colors as the hat, so it's just the walnut stain, ground espresso, and then mustard seed. And you'll see me pop around. I don't know if you've noticed that as I'm coloring, I'll do one section and then I'll move to another section that's farther away. And then I'll come back to that section from previously. And so I move around because if it's too wet, it'll start to bleed into those other areas. So I like to give it a little bit of time to dry. And then that way I can come back and not risk the bleeding of, say, the dress into the flowers. Because if the dress was still really wet, it could kind of bleed into each other, and then those colors will kind of muddle. This kind of creates a barrier for me. I used a bunch of various colors for the flowers. I'm using a very small palette of colors that I can use over and over again. So the flowers had the wilted violet, peacock feathers, mustard seed, and then I pulled in another pink color called worn lipstick. And then I mixed those color flowers. I didn't want them to be just one flat color. So I layered like the pink over the yellow, the blue and the purple together. So those give the flowers just a little bit more interest. They're not so flat. And then the leaves are mowed lawn, and I just used one color for those. And to finish everything up, I'm using black soot for the bicycle, the tires and the handlebars. And then I'm going to add just a hint of shadow and be very light-handed with this to all the dark spaces in her dress, all the places that will be considered kind of shadows on the image, which to me is the bottom left. So anything that's sitting on top of something else will get some shadow underneath on the bottom left of the image. Gonna finish that off, again, being very light-handed with that black soot. I don't want to get too dark where it starts to look very sooty, I guess is the right word. It'll start to look just kind of dingy and dark and dirty. And I don't want that effect. I mean, that looks great if you're looking for a distressed effect, but I just wanted to add shadow. And then I'm just going to make sure she's nice and dry. I'm using my heat tool to dry the front and back, and I will set her aside a little bit and she'll dry out even more. I attempted to add a bit of white highlight to her hair, her hat, the flowers, but the waxy feel to this pigment formula, it had a hard time allowing me to put any type of white gel pen over the top. So you can attempt it. Maybe there's a better gel pen or white pen out there. I had some others, but they've dried out. So I'm just going to say skip it at this point if you're using the Distress Watercolor Pencils. So now that she's dry, I'm going to go ahead and fussy cut her out. I just really like to fussy cut. It's one of my favorite things to do. I'm leaving a white border all the way around her. And then using my scissors as I'm cutting, I'm turning the paper. That way I'll get a nice smooth edge to my cuts. Now I have my sentiment stamped on a panel of, again, that white cardstock from Hammermill. And I'm using tumbled glass to do some ink blending. I'm only going to be using the left-hand side of this panel. So I'm starting my ink blending off on the right side and then moving it over to the left. And that way I don't get like all the blotchiness on the left side of my panel. I want that blotchiness to start happening on the right side because I'm going to get rid of it. And then it'll create this nice smooth ink blend. As I build up those layers, I'm using a circular motion and doing light layer after light layer, and it'll build itself up as I continue to go along. It may look a little blotchy at this point, but as the ink soaks in and starts to blend itself out, the more it sits. And then I'm taking some water and splattering it over the top, and I'm just going to tap that away with a cloth. And then that will kind of create those water splatters. I love that effect with any type of water reactive ink. And now we're going to get rid of the right side and just tear away that sentiment side. And I'm going to tear towards me so I get the white edge of the paper. Now I have the same size panel. I'm going to put that into an embossing folder and run that through my die cut machine. Sadly, this embossing folder is retired since I got it at Joann's. So you'll just want to use your favorite embossing folder, whatever you have. And then I'm going to use liquid glue to adhere that together. Just because there's a lot of texture in that panel, I want to make sure that there's a nice solid adhesion of my sentiment panel over the top. Just going to lift that edge just a little bit, and then I'm going to use a block and kind of hold it there in place for a few seconds just to make sure that glue has plenty of time to really grab onto the paper. And try lift that up one more time so there's a little bit of dimension between that transition. Add a bit of foam tape, and I'm just going to put that down to the center of a 4¼ by 5½ inch card base. Pop up my girl right in that transition area so we can still see the sentiment, but she's still kind of overlapping that ink blended line. And here is the final card. I love how the soft ink blending, watercolor pencils, and embossed texture all come together for a fresh spring feel. You'll find all the supplies listed in the description of this video and over at my dollhouse-designs.com blog. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to check out my channel for more card making tutorials. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you again soon for another video.